Hi there. I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Our show is about Russia and the collapse of the U.S.-Russia relationship since the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. We visualized a partnership earlier with Russia, but the partnership unfortunately failed. Thomas Graham, a Russia expert, is with us, and he will tell us why. He is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and was senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff during the George W. Bush administration. He is the author of the terrific new book, Getting Russia Right, and was one of 3 former national security officials to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov in secret back-channel talks last April, possibly paving a way forward to end the war in Ukraine. It's a pleasure to welcome Tom Graham back to the program.
Great to be with you, Jim.
Okay, so let's start with Ukraine, Tom. We've been there in a proxy war for almost 2 years. What do you see as having been accomplished? You called it an unjustifiable invasion on the part of Russia. So where are we, and what do you see as the way forward?
Well, 2023 was very much the year of failed offensives. The Russians had a winter offensive, gained almost no territory at all. The much anticipated Ukrainian summer counteroffensive is pretty much stalled at this point. The battle lines are where they were at the beginning of this year. So we're in a position of warfare. And the question really is, how do you go forward? How do the Ukrainians push back against Russian aggression? How do they hold open the hope of expelling Russia from all the territory that Russia has seized, not only in this latest act of aggression, but since 2014 when they seized Crimea, as we know. So that is a big question, I think, that we have to focus on at this point.
So at this point, Ukraine controls roughly 80% of the country, and Russia controls 20%. Is there any prospect of Ukrainians retaking the 20% of their country in the east?
I don't think there are very good prospects of doing that in the near term. And that's why I think the Ukrainians themselves need to rethink their strategy and redefine victory, at least in the short term. The way President Vladimir Zelensky has talked of victory is expelling Russia from all the territory that they've seized since 2014. I think a more important goal for Ukraine, and one that is achievable, is building a strong, prosperous, democratic Ukraine that is anchored in Europe. And that requires a somewhat different mindset and a different set of policies at this point.
All the while waging war?
Yes, absolutely. You can't stop the conflict. The Russians are not going to stop. We have had no indication over the past 2 years that Russia, particularly President Putin, is inclined to stop this war. He's not willing to negotiate anything other than Ukraine's capitulation, and clearly that is not something that Kiev is going to agree to. So Kiev needs to continue battling the Russian forces. We in the West need to continue to supply Ukraine with the material and the financial support it needs to wage that struggle. But instead of trying to break through Russian lines to seize more territory, I think the goal over the next several months, maybe the next year or so, really should be defensive. That is, preventing the Russians from seizing any more territory in Ukraine.
And what about Crimea?
Well, Crimea is an area that the Ukrainians have been trying to attack in various ways over the past several months, but I still think that remains more or less firmly in the hands of Russia. That is an issue for the future. It's not an issue for the immediate near term, I would argue.
You're, of course, aware of an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs by Richard Haas and Charles Kupchan, your colleagues, on the visit with Lavrov. And they say the time has really come to park and to shift from offense to defense. I think that's consistent with what you're saying, but they think there'll be that's in conjunction with a ceasefire. Do you agree with them, or?
Well, I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire at this point. If the Ukrainians were to offer to the Russians might accept temporarily, but using that period to rebuild, to regroup, and to launch further offenses in the future. Again, there is no intention on the part of the Kremlin of stopping this offensive against Ukraine. They haven't clearly defined what victory is in their mind, but it clearly is not what they have at this point. My take is a somewhat different. As I said, I think the Ukraine should focus on the defensive, but we need to continue to supply material. In particular, we need to supply Ukraine with the types of missile systems they need for aerial defense, and use that type of Iron Dome, if that's an expression we can use for Ukraine, to create the conditions in which public and private corporations are prepared to invest in Ukraine and begin to rebuild the economy. That, coupled with the accession talks with the EU that are supposed to begin in the near future, that will put a focus on political, economic reform in Ukraine, bringing it close to Europe, are part of what I think the goal for Ukraine should be, certainly in the near term, and that is building a strong, prosperous, democratic Ukraine anchored in Europe. That is, to my mind, victory. Territory is a secondary issue, important, but not something that they need to resolve in the next year or two.
Well, do you think that'll lead to Ukraine's becoming a member of NATO?
I don't think so, not at this point, and that is because I don't think the politics are right for that. One, it'd be very difficult to get 31 members of NATO, soon to be 32 with the admission of Sweden, to agree on that. And remember, it only takes one country to be opposed for that to not to happen. Hungary, for example, would be a candidate for that. The second is I think you need to take into account the politics in the United States. For Ukraine to join NATO at this point, we would need a two-thirds vote in the Senate. It was easy to get the two-thirds vote for Finland and Sweden, long-standing partners of the United States, well-developed militaries, clear benefit to the alliance when they asked for admission. Ukraine is another matter, and as we've seen over the past several weeks, there are differing views inside the political establishment, particularly with the Republican Party, as to the level at which the United States should support Ukraine. Therefore, I don't think it's possible to get the two-thirds of the Senate. You would need to bring Ukraine into NATO. Therefore, security, Ukraine's security, has to be guaranteed in a different fashion, and that, to my mind, is pretty much a continuation of what we're doing now, providing weapons, financial aid, providing intelligence support, helping the Ukrainians rebuild and modernize their own defense industrial sector so that they can begin to supply their own military and therefore create the type of Ukraine that Russia would realize it has very little chances of conquering through aggressive action.
Well, what about the recent action we've seen in the House of Representatives where they link aid to Ukraine, including military aid, to aid to Israel? And they're all for aid to Israel, but the Republicans, particularly the MAGA Republicans in the House of Representatives, say, well, but nothing for Ukraine. So if the money isn't forthcoming, how do we finance the defense initiative, which you've advocated?
Right, exactly, but it's not clear that the money is not forthcoming. Again, if you look at the Congress, there's still a large bipartisan backing for funding Ukraine, for supporting Ukraine. The House is problematic because there is a significant segment of the Republican Party that is opposed or has questions about this. If you could get it to the floor, it would still pass overwhelmingly. Democratic support and probably at least half the Republicans. So we've got a procedural issue of how to bring it to the floor. That is going to require some, I think, very tough negotiations between the White House and the House at this point, the new Speaker. But I feel confident that at the end of the day, that type of support will be forthcoming. And the administration, while it might not get all the $60 billion, it has requested at this point a significant share of that, and enough that to allow the United States to continue to fund Ukraine.
To my knowledge, we've had no formal contacts with the Russians over Ukraine. since the conflict started. But you had a back-channel meeting with Lavrov, along with your two colleagues, Mr. Kupchin and Mr. Haas. My question is, number one, is there anything you can tell us that came out of that meeting? And number two, do you think we should have more back-channel meetings so we continue to communicate with the Russians and engage with them on this issue?
Well, let me first start by saying it wasn't a back-channel communication, because this was not in any way set up as a meeting in which the Russians intended to pass messages to the U.S. government, nor we on our side intended to pass messages on behalf of the American government to the Russian government. This was really an exchange of views on not only Ukraine, but more broadly the state of U.S.-Russian relations. Foreign Minister Lavrov, like Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, when he travels abroad, often meets with local experts. Purely an exchange of views to get a sense of what people are thinking in the other country. That would be factored perhaps into Russian foreign policy. But again, it's not intended to send messages. It's not intended to inform the U.S. government of anything in particular that they have been unable to do through official channels. All that said, I'm a big supporter of back channels. I do believe that we need to have some form of communication between the White House and the Kremlin, the United States and Russia at this point. We need to have it in a channel that is strictly confidential. There are a lot of sensitive issues that we need to discuss. And given the state of the relationship, given attitudes in the United States, attitudes in Russia, anything that is done in public stands very little chance of being effective, in part because it will spark controversy in both Moscow and in Washington. So back channels, strictly confidential, focus on some sensitive issues in the relationship.
Well, it's a wonderful lead-in into your book, which is the essential nature of our deteriorated relationship with the Russians. I don't remember a time in my lifetime anyway where the relationship has been so strained. I mean, maybe we could think of the Berlin crisis, or the airlift, or perhaps the Cuban Missile Crisis, but apart from that, we seem to have been riding pretty easily with little blips along the line. But your book is entitled, has the intriguing title, What Went Wrong, or Getting Russia Right. So assuming we need to get Russia right, what went wrong in the first place?
Look, the narrative in the West is pretty much that Putin came to power in the year 1999, 2000, reversed all the promising reforms of the first post-Soviet decade, took Russia down an authoritarian track, moved towards an expansionist, imperialist foreign policy, and undid all the good work that the United States had tried to do in order to build this partnership with Russia. There's a certain element of truth in that, but I think it applies most dramatically to the period after 2012, 2014, when Putin comes back for his third term as president. And there you see an individual who was intent on undermining what he considers American hegemony, what he calls a rules-based order that is really nothing more than hypocrisy, a cover for America's geopolitical advance at the expense of Russia. And you've seen the seizure of Ukraine, the insertion of troops into Syria, the interference in our elections in 2016, of the invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine most recently, as efforts to push back against the United States and erode the U.S. position in the world. And certainly Putin, I think, bears a greater part of the responsibility for the deterioration from 2014 on. But if you look at the way the policy developed in the immediate years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we would argue that there's certain things that we could have done differently. that might have led to a different type of result. Not the enduring partnership that we hoped for at that time, but not the adversarial relationship we have now. Something more along the lines of what I would call constructive competition between two countries that have radically different worldviews, grounded in their history, their political traditions. We are going to be rivals. The question is how you manage that rivalry going forward in ways that reduce the risk of military confrontation between our two countries.
Well, a lot of the aggravation in the relationship is on us, isn't that right? We did say that we were declaring a war on terrorism, and you were either with the terrorists or you were with us. Putin ascribed to that and thought we were united on international terrorism, but when it came to Chechnya and Breslin, the United States appeared to say, well, this wasn't terrorism, this was some sort of political revolution against Putin. Now, of course, that was provocative, if nothing else. And there were other instances, the oil pipeline that you refer to in the book, and the attempt by Russia to organize a coalition of independent states that we saw as an attempt at domination. So he had some occasion to be put out with us. Then, of course, you had his own aspiration to be another Peter the Great or another Catherine the Great. But what I wanted to ask you about was that something happened to him in 2012, didn't it? When if he was Peter the Great, if he was Catherine the Great, if he was, he would, even if he was Stalin, there would be some element of realpolitik. But he shifted to some sort of messianic vision that he was the new czar of the Russias, and he was authoritarian and was going to engage in conquest. So
right, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, first, you are right that Chechnya was a major problem for Putin. As you said, President Bush presented the world with a binary choice. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. When it came to Chechnya, we knew that there were certain elements of within the Chechen rebellion that were terrorist, and we recognized as terrorists. When Moscow was looking for support for us against the Chechens, we said, well, you know, but there is this element of the Chechen rebellion that has legitimate grievances that go back far deep into Russian history and Chechen history. That was contrary, obviously, to the way we were framing this issue for others, and that led Putin to believe that our counterterrorism campaign was really nothing more than a smokescreen for geopolitical advance in Russia, in the former Soviet space at Russia's expense. You're also right that we've seen a change in Putin himself. When he first came to power, and this was a time when I was in the administration, we had regular contact with Putin. I sat in on some meetings with Putin. He really was a practitioner of realpolitik, very pragmatic in the way he calculated the balance of power, not an individual that took great risks. And in that way slowly rebuilt Russian power and led to Russia's playing a larger role on the global stage. When he came back in 2012, you began to see a shift in the way he thought, this movement away from pragmatism to messianism, this view of himself as a great czar who was going to gather the Russian lands the way all the great czars had done previously in history. More recently, he's talked of himself and Russia as this leader of an international anti-colonial movement, despite the fact that you find very few countries in the global south that really want to sign on fully with to Putin's crusade against the West. So a messianic element, exacerbated, I would argue, beginning with the pandemic when Putin himself went into extreme isolation, cut off from sort of normal interchange with his ministers, focused on a very narrow group of advisors, and that allowed his imagination, I think, to carry him away to these delusions of grandeur of the role that he and Russia were going to play on the global stage that I think are quite clearly beyond Russia's capabilities and beyond his as well.
Do you fault the United States for failing to take risks during this period of the early 2000s to thwart Putin's messianism? I mean, when he went into Crimea, Obama did nothing, and that only encouraged him to think that we were irresolute.
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument that perhaps Obama should have been more forceful at that time. But you need to remember, again, the context. Obama, like all previous presidents since the end of the Cold War, really had little regard for Russian power. Obama once denigrated Russia as little more than a regional power. At one point he said, I'm more concerned about a terrorist bomb in Manhattan, more concerned about the Ebola crisis in Africa than I am about Russia. And so that, I think, in part helps explain the response you got to Crimea. Beyond that, the Obama administration also thought that it needed Russian cooperation for two things that were much more important to the president at that point. The Iran nuclear deal, and it is quite clear that Russia played an instrumental role in concluding the JCPOA with the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. Obama was also worried about the emergence of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and hoped that he could use Russia as a partner in pushing back against that as well. So given the balance of challenges that the administration faced, given the president's own assessment of Russian power, he thought the right approach was to go light on Russia as far as Crimea was concerned, in order to maintain the possibility of working with Russia both on Iran and against ISIS.
And how does it all play out? Russia's in Crimea. The Iran nuclear deal cratered. And Russia went into Syria, really was ineffective against ISIS, but they were very effective in suppressing the resolution against Assad. So we came out with one big zero, didn't we?
Yeah, we didn't do very well at that point. I still believe, if you look back at that time, there was a need for not closer cooperation, but more intensive in communication with the Russians at that point, trying to sketch out what might be a more promising future for the relationship between the two countries. There were still things we needed to do in terms of European security. Clearly, we had concerns about China. So there was an agenda, a positive agenda with Russia at that time that we should have pursued. We didn't. And so firmness when it comes to Crimea, firmness when it comes to Iran, but coupled with a willingness to talk to the Russians about European security, coupled with a more, I think, open conversation with Russia about the challenges that China was going to pose both to the United States and Russia over the long term. That type of balance is something that was lacking in the relationship. And because of that lack of balance, we saw what Putin did in Crimea and in Syria deepen, as I said, with the interference in the American elections, and then ultimately the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Okay, Tom, so this has really been wonderful, but we've come to the end of our time. But I have a question for you. And my question for you, Tom Graham, is there any hope of getting Russia right as long as Vladimir Putin is around?
It is difficult to get Russia right as long as Vladimir Putin is around. The point we need to remember is that Russia, no matter what happens in Ukraine, Russia is going to remain a major challenge for the United States going forward. We're not going to see a democratic revolution. We're not going to see the country break up. It has elements of power that will bring to bear on the global stage. We also need to remember that Russia has been a rival of the United States from the moment the United States emerged as a major power at the very end of the 19th century. So no partnership, no reset. The challenge for the United States is moving from an adversarial relationship to one of constructive competition. I think we can do that. It would be easier to do with a new face at the helm of Russia, but at the end of the day, if Putin's going to be around for a long time, we'll have to do it with Putin.
And you think we can do it with Putin?
It's difficult, but through deft diplomacy, I think the United States can do it.
With deft diplomacy. Right. So Tom Graham, the embodiment of deft diplomacy.
Right.
Thank you for coming by, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Meanwhile, be well, take care, and all the best.